Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today in today's session of the Gerhart Center webinar series, The Aftermath of the COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. We launched the series in April with the aim of discussing concepts that are currently mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. Today is the 21st session, and it's a joint webinar between the Gerhart Center and the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth, the ILO. We have with us two distinguished speakers, Susanna Puerto and Jonas Bosch. They will represent highlights of the Global Youth Survey and the COVID-19 and some emphasis on the areas of social activism. Susanna Puerto leads the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth, an inclusive and multi-stakeholders partnership chaired by the ILO to scale up action and impact on youth employment within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Prior to joining the ILO, Susanna worked at the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. She serves on a number of executive boards of youth employment partnerships. Jonas is a youth employment expert with the ILO in Geneva. He advises ILO constituents on delivering and monitoring youth facilitators in areas of training and workshops. He previously served as an M&E officer of Decent Jobs for Egypt's Young People Project at the ILO office in Cairo. He also worked with the OECD in Paris in improving effectiveness of development cooperation. We will have a different variation today. We'll have a discussant, and our discussant is Yara Ouda. Yara is from the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, UNMGCY. She's a regional focal point for MENA and West Asia. She's a graduate of FEPS, Faculty of Economics and Political Sciences, Cairo University, 2016, and she's been doing lots of work with the African Union as a freelancer and also with the Arab Youth Platform for Sustainable Development. The way we're going to go about things, we'll have 20 minutes of presentation from Susanna and Jonas. Then we're going to have a 20 minutes of discussion, Yara and Susanna, and I'll ask them a few questions. And then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A compiled from the participants. If you have a question, please send it through the chat box to me directly. And we'll have 2 minutes in the end to wrap up. So without much ado, I'll pass it to Jonas and to Susanna. And it's a pleasure to have you both.
Thank you very much, Ali. And thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar. We hope to see the number of participants increasing soon. And it is very much a pleasure to join you and share with you our work through the Global Initiative, but as well the recent results from an online survey that we conducted in collaboration with many partners, very much trying to understand what is the impact of the pandemic on young people. So let me go straight into the presentation. Thank you. So first, just to introduce the Global Initiative, this is an effort of the UN system. It is indeed led by the ILO under the mandate, a mandate received from the UN system to strengthen collaboration within the system, as well as going beyond the system and collaborating with other entities and organizations from governments, private sector, social partners, academia, youth organizations, and other civil society organizations, with the understanding and recognition that by working together, we can do more than individually, and very much along the lines of a goal that includes and it's focused on scaling up the action and the impact on youth employment through effective, innovative, and evidence-based interventions. So in this, let's say, with this objective and the scope of work, the Global Initiative has today over 75 partner organizations and focuses specifically on some thematic priorities which are not the universe of everything we can do on youth employment, but it certainly gives us some concrete entry points to advance youth employment. And those thematic priorities range from boosting decent work in the digital economy, in the green economy, quality apprenticeships, supporting the transition from the informal to the formal economy, youth in the rural economy, and young people that are also facing, are working in hazardous occupations, others that are facing fragile situations, either because of conflicts or because of disasters. We also have a very strong focus or another thematic line of work on youth entrepreneurship and self-employment. And let's say within that composite of different thematic areas, we all work together very much towards advancing and strengthening an alliance of diverse partners, ensuring that there is action at the country level, securing the production of knowledge resources that can help in the design and implementation of youth employment programs, and also by synergizing as regards to resources that are being pledged towards improving lives and jobs for young people. So let me move to the next slide, where we're going to start delving straight into some information about the crisis and what is very much the impact that we see COVID-19 has posed on young people's lives. So first of all, this slide shows you some figures in a pre-COVID environment. Now, this is very much to explain that even before COVID, young people were highly vulnerable in the labor market. So when COVID comes, it finds young people in situations that are either low quality jobs or unemployment or in the midst of a transition, and that indeed the pandemic, what it does is it exacerbates the challenges that young people were experiencing. And the ILO, the International Labour Organization, published a policy paper, a policy brief that describes three particular shocks or transmissions that COVID-19 crisis poses on youth. So the first one focuses very much on disruptions in education and training. So we know when the pandemic arrived, many young people had to stop their studies, and many of them transitioned into some sort of online delivery with a significant number of challenges. So bearing in mind that it takes about 14 months for young people to transition from school to jobs, it is important to understand that the disruptions in education, disruption in the pace of education, in the continuity of education, may have very harsh impacts on the transitions of young people. And speaking of transitions, the second item very much focuses on those young people that before the crisis were already in unemployment. And as you guys know, being in unemployment also means that that young people are actively looking for a job. And at the same time, there were other young people that were in the process of transitioning because they have just finished their studies or because of other reasons that they were in the midst of that transition. And we know before the crisis, there were 267 million young people that were not in employment, education, and training. So counting, bearing this reality in mind and understanding that many vacancies closed, that there were increased challenges in the transition. So we can expect that the pandemic can exacerbate the number of youth that are in a need status and make those transitions much more arduous. And the last one is about the job losses and reductions in incomes, and this we have seen across the world. The impacts of the pandemic on the jobs of young people are important. It is also important to understand that unemployment among youth is very sensitive to recession. So we have seen that many young people have lost their jobs, and even though we are waiting for labor market for surveys to be updated and for us to have a better understanding of what is the impact, what we certainly know is that when COVID-19 came, it found 178 million young people employed in the sectors that turned out to be the most vulnerable. And that includes accommodation, retail, food, etc. And this is something I haven't mentioned, but it is important to see that across all these dimensions, young women are particularly disadvantaged. So something to bear in mind, and I imagine many of you are also working with young women or for young women. So it is important to visualize and understand that even if rightly we see a very strong impact on youth, we expect that the impact on young women will be even more stronger. So the next slide will very much take us straight into the survey. So let's say, bearing all this, recognizing the potential impact on youth employment in collaboration with partners, that includes the AIESEC, the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, the European Commission, the European Youth Forum, and the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. We work together towards designing a survey at a moment where we started in April, we finished in May, and within this period, you can see that it was a period of growth, both in terms of cases and in terms of number of deaths. And even though sort of the positive, the increasing numbers of cases and deaths continue, this was a period of time where it was quite steep, the number of cases. For the young people that responded to our survey, what we see is that 9 out of 10 of them lived in countries where they were subjected to closures, to lockdowns, and certainly workplace closures in at least some sectors. So this also speaks about the extent of sort of who are the young people who responded to the survey, and the experiences or sort of the environment that was surrounding them, because indeed almost all survey respondents live in countries with mandated school closures, and around half of them live in countries with workplace closures, as I mentioned before. So if we move to the next slide, this is very much to give you an idea of the survey, a bit on just to let you know what is the methodology we followed and how we promote it. So we opted for a non-probabilistic sampling where people will simply just opt in. We had the survey available in 23 countries, and we did the promotion through social media, but also we rely strongly on our partners and their own networks to make sure that they will share the survey with their beneficiaries or partners. So this is what we call a snowball sampling. So, and that's how we managed to reach a large number of young people, even though the youth definition that we often like to use, it very much starts from 15 to 29. We decided to cut the minimum age at 18. And we also, just for your information, we had quite a straightforward questionnaire, about 44 questions, and we estimated around 10 minutes of response. As is typical in some cases, some young people start a survey, but they don't finish. But in this situation, what we see is a 65% completion rate, which is not bad for a survey of this scale. In the next slide, you can see the diversity of responses by looking into the numbers, the countries that participated. So what we see is that countries in blue in the map are represented by at least some individuals in the survey. It is important to note that participation across countries was different. So we may have, even though there are countries that are shaded here, the numbers are bigger in some countries versus others. But at the end of the day, what is important to our survey is that our final data set that includes young people 18 to 29 has 12,605 responses. So this is it gives you an idea of the geographical distribution and how much we managed to capture information from different types of countries. We wish we could have gotten more responses from low-income countries, but unfortunately, it might have been the online nature of the survey. But you know, the response, the characteristics of our respondents are not so close to low-income countries. So if we move to the next slide, that will help me bring you a little bit more information about the representativeness of the survey. So based on the responses we got and the information, the personal information, sort of the descriptions of the young people that participated, we know that the young people, you know, that the survey is representative of young people that are working and that have tertiary education, as well as is also representative of students. This is the majority of the sample that the survey captured. And when we speak about results, it's very important to bear this in mind. No? This is not a survey that is representatively for all young people across the globe, but it is important to know this very much features the aspirations and the experiences of working youth with higher education and students. So also important to say that among the young workers who were not pursuing education, 85% of them had attained tertiary education, which is, let's say, another way of understanding the high levels of education in our survey. Also important to note here that we rely on statistical weights. This help us to improve the representativeness of the survey. When we use the weights, basically what we do is we take the raw data that we receive from the surveys and we apply weights as regards to gender, and this is important because we receive quite 64% of the responses came from young women. So by weighting the sample, it helps us to balance out the responses and understand, let's say, give a greater strength to the data we receive. We run a number of robustness checks to make sure that the weighting has been correctly, that the information that we are delivering has was strong and was not going to vary depending on regions or countries. So it turns out that we got quite high robustness through those checks, and with that we were happy to then delve into the analysis, and now I'll pass the word to Jonas, who will walk you through the main results that we find from the survey. Thank you. Jonas, over to you.
Thank you, Susanna. I will take over here to talk a little bit about the results that we see. Also mindful of the time. We have in the survey looked at different types of outcomes, how COVID has affected young people. We looked at their employment outcomes, education, but also importantly, mental well-being, rights, social activism, and their view towards policy responses that have been taken to combat the pandemic. I'll just focus on some of the highlights, but just to say before delving into the details that we see huge and disproportionate impacts on young people really along various dimensions, among the employment dimension, but also when it comes to education, mental well-being, and I'll come to that in a second. So regarding employment, we see that 1 in 6 young people who reported to have worked before the onset of the pandemic since then have stopped working. That can mean 17% globally. Stop working, just as important to clarify, doesn't necessarily imply that they are unemployed and they have lost their job. It could also mean that they have been furloughed. They just own their business, or the employer they are working for has closed momentarily, but they're still employed or maybe expect to return. We don't measure that specifically, but we already see this is a very huge and significant impact from on young workers. More worrisome perhaps is if we look here at this chart that now disaggregates the result by age. We see that essentially the younger workers are, the more they are affected. The youngest age group, 18 to 24, is significantly more affected than younger workers. And when we then look a little bit to try to understand what is driving this and what is going on, we realize that this is not necessarily related per age per se, but it is very much related to the kind of jobs that young people are doing versus older youth, say above the age of 25 or 30. And to understand that better, we also asked young people what their occupation is, and then we went and coded these answers and divided them according to the ISCO International Standard Classification of Occupation Index into here 4 broad categories: managers, professionals. Professionals would be typically jobs for which you need a university degree, technicians and associate professionals. That would be typically either a first graduate degree or some non-tertiary post-secondary education, and then support, service, and sales occupations, which is kind of a very broad category. And even though it's important to bear in mind what Susanna just said, that we mainly represent highly educated youth, not all of these highly educated youth obviously have yet fully transitioned to the labor market and found, say, a job in the professional category, but some of them, a third of them more or less, work in this last category of support and sales workers. And we see that they have been, and these are particularly younger youth, and they have been hit the most. So we see that almost 1 in 4 young, or more than 1 in 4 young people in this category has stopped. And these are obviously arguably the more vulnerable jobs and the more vulnerable youth in terms of employment conditions, of pay, social protection. They are being hit the most. That is quite remarkable and quite a source of concern. We also ask young people regarding their working hours, and we see that overall working hours have decreased by around 1/4. And so asking everyone the amount of hours they have worked before the crisis and now during the pandemic. And then here what you see in this first column is the share of young workers that said hours have reduced. So 1 in 2 young workers has indicated that their hours have reduced, some all the way down to 0, some just a little bit, but overall you see that a majority, or like half of young workers, have been affected in some way. And quite interestingly, we see that this effect is more pronounced in like lower middle and low income countries, also showing that this crisis and effects on hours worked are unequally distributed around the globe. We are also asking about income and productivity, and here it's just important to note these numbers don't show the reduction in income by, say, 42%, but that's really the share of young people. So 42 out of 5 young people said that they had some reduction in income without quantifying it further. Same for self-assessed productivity. Now in this context where many people, including young people, are working from home, we have asked, how has your work-related productivity developed since the crisis? And almost 2/3, 3 out of 5 young people say their productivity has decreased, with young women more likely to report it than young men, and again a disproportionate impact on lower income countries. I think that just shows the disruptions to the world of work that young people have experiencing. But these disruptions have not been solely confined to, say, the workplace. They're also very much present for young people in education. We see that the majority of people are is living in countries of school closures, and 3/4 of the young students in the sample say indeed their schools have been closed. Now, what you see here is we have been asked about alternative learning methods, at-home assignments, video lectures, online testing, and we see that maybe maybe quite surprisingly or not, depends I guess where you're coming from, but like one in 6 young people say that they don't receive any education at all, meaning 5 in 6 young people, they receive some kind of education. And here we see kind of the trend is inverse to what we reported in the employment outcomes. The more upper middle and high income countries, they show a higher share of young people receiving alternative forms of education, and that I believe just quite frankly highlights the digital divide that of course has been a reality pre-COVID, but now because of everything moving online, education taking essentially place in the bedroom instead of the classroom, and at home, there is just a disproportionate impact of this disruption in places where capacities to move teaching and curricular online just aren't as developed as in other places. Then, of course, what is important for us to understand is how this disruption to education impacts learning outcomes. And we have just taken a very straightforward approach, asking young people and how their learning has developed to let them assess that themselves. And 2 out of 3 young people worldwide say that now they're learning less since the onset of the crisis. And that is true throughout all kind of country income categories. And this really shows that even in places where a substantial share of educational programs has moved online, still a lot of people feel that this doesn't quite make up for what, and that's maybe unsurprising, for what has been delivered before. And maybe more worrisome here is that we also ask, what do you anticipate will happen to your education? Do you think your education will be delayed in terms of graduation? And almost half of young people, they think that their education might be delayed, and even around 1 in 10, 9%, they think their education might fail. And of course, that is a great concern, because it might mean that young people might, this might change the educational trajectories of entire cohort, young people who previously have wanted to graduate from a technical school or from a university, and for whatever reason now are not able to do that anymore, and for whom it might be not an option to just go to school 1 additional year. And that might certainly will most likely have very long-term impacts on these young people. Now, just taking a few more minutes, but I'm Dr. I'm mindful of the time here. We also looked at mental well-being, and we believe this is tremendously important, because after all, what we want to do, of course, by providing decent jobs to young people is, this is not an end to itself, but should contribute to their well-being and the well-being of their communities. How do we measure mental well-being? Of course, is a bit of a tricky concept, and we measure it here by employing a standardized 7-item mental well-being scale developed by the University of Edinburgh and others, asking people about how they have been feeling in the past 2 weeks. People are answering 7 different items, and then scores are, we calculate the score from this. And if your score falls below a certain threshold, then we can say that this person is probably suffering from anxiety or depression. This is how this measure works. And we find quite strikingly that 1 out of 6 young people participating in the survey are assessed to be probably affected by anxiety or depression. Also, young women show significantly lower levels of mental well-being than young men, which should be a concern, especially in the context of increased double burden, potentially increased household responsibilities for many young women around the globe, as opposed to young men. these inequalities which have been very stark and before the crisis might yet again have been amplified by the pandemic. And just to link this discussion, last point on this slide, a little bit to what has been said before, we divided now the sample when it comes to workers here into everyone who has been working and is still working. So those that have not been massively affected by the crisis versus those that stopped working. And the same for education. We looked at those that say my education is on track versus all the others. And we do see that those that have been heavily affected in terms of education or employment also show much lower levels of mental well-being. And one might say this makes perfect sense, and it does, but it's also very scary because it shows that impacts on the labor market and on education, they have very real consequences on mental well-being of young people right now. Now, to finish this presentation a bit on a more upbeat note, we also looked into social activism. What are young people doing to mitigate the social effects of COVID-19? And the good news is that young people overwhelmingly want to help. They showed very high levels, indicated very high levels in the survey of staying at home, reaching out to friends and family. 1/3 of young people showed a very high level of willing to volunteer and willing to donate to charities. In addition, I think that this really highlights how young people from the really get-go of this crisis have been part of the solution. And more encouragingly, we also looked, and it's not shown here on this slide, but we also looked at trends over time, as the survey has been running for 5 weeks, and we see that the level of volunteering also increased throughout time. So, after perhaps an initial shock, young people are progressively looking into opportunities to contribute and volunteer. We also asked an open question, how did you help others? And identified kind of the main themes that came up that were around combating misinformation about sanitation, hygiene, assisting elderly disabled, and distributing food and PPE. Just to highlight some of the exemplary youth recommendations that then have been made in terms of what would you do? We asked the question, what would you do if you were the leader of your country? What would you do to combat this crisis? And we got lots of recommendations around universal basic income and subsidies, especially for those most affected. Example from this gentleman from Brazil. Others shared examples of how they had stayed at home yet learned new skills. We got advice from young people that it's important now to provide income training and employment support for young people. And as said before, many young people highlighted how they have tried to fight misinformation and fake news about COVID-19 to help people stay safe. I want to finish, and this is the last slide, by just opening a little bit the door to all the policy discussions that we had here in the ILO. The ILO has put forward a framework to member states and constituents to combat COVID-19 and the impacts on the world of work, and focusing on 4 pillars. The first is stimulating the economy, so really enabling and putting in place counter-cyclical fiscal policies. Very many countries have done that, but it's important to not take back these fiscal stimuli too early, and keep supporting enterprises, jobs, and incomes for example, through youth guarantees, through investments, including in digital education, through enlarging social protection, and also making sure that young people, importantly, are covered by these social protection programs, for example, unemployment benefits or subsidized employment. Many young people, as we have seen in this survey, they work in perhaps jobs for which, perhaps in low-skilled jobs, or in jobs where they just, because they are young and just started to work, haven't yet fulfilled the statutory minimum contribution period, say for unemployment benefits. And in these exceptional circumstances, it's just important to take steps to make sure that young people are covered by those kind of policies as well. It's crucially important that the third pillar here to protect workers in the workplace, which means to keep them safe, to make sure they have access to personal protective equipment, but also, and that's something this survey really highlighted, to provide psychosocial support measures and to closely collaborate with training institutions and education institutions in that. Last but not least, what is very important for the ILO is that these solutions are negotiated on the basis of social dialogue. Social dialogue meaning a dialogue between the government, employers, and workers' organization on how to keep workers safe and protect jobs. This dialogue should happen not just about young people, but with young people, and workers' organizations, employers' organizations, they should strive towards integrating young people more into their mechanism, especially when policies are on the table that will affect young people. Social dialogue is also a means to promote youth rights, and this most certainly also in this crisis includes the right to disconnect and to put a clear line between the world of work and all the other responsibilities that young people are having these days. And with these words, I'm going to thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion now with Ali and Yara and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, Suzanne. Now, we'll have, I know we're a little bit behind time. We'll try to make it up, but we're probably going to be 5-10 minutes behind time, which is okay. I just wanted to give Jonas and Susanna enough time to sort of go through the slides and the important results of the survey that has been done. Now, Yara and Susanna, I wanted to get a little bit of your feedback about my first point. My first question is, how did the youth priority changed in light of the COVID-19? And I want you to reflect on the survey, of course, but also on the policy priorities, making progress to achieve the Egypt Vision 2030, the Africa Agenda 2063 in general. So the floor is yours, Yara.
Thank you, Dr. Aouni, and thanks, Jonas and Susanna, for the insightful presentation and information there shared. First of all, I'd like to send my pride to all the youth listening to us and to everybody. You are champions after what happened during the last month. And my condolences to anyone who lost a dear friend or person in their lives. This is very important to mention. As we all pass through, I'm quite sure, different behavior change in our daily life routine. So it's important to make sure that you're feeling well right now and after that. Basically, going back to your question, Dr. Aouni, on youth priorities change in the light of COVID-19. Well, as we realized that on the national base, on the continental, regional, international base, there have been many surveys done by the youth-led organizations, whether by the African Union Youth Envoy or the UN Youth Envoy, in regards to changes in how youth see changes in their priorities in regards to the agendas they are working on. So we see that mainly youth started to think about how digitalization can achieve fair globalization or equal access to different services by everybody, leaving no one behind. Also, youth leadership in achieving good governance and their participation in good governance. Employment is very important for youth recently, especially after what we heard from Susanna and Jonas, how people lost their jobs or they are not employed even before the COVID, and the COVID made their employment more difficult after the pandemic. Also, women of low income and anybody who has been affected by the COVID. So employment is very important, decent jobs, education, promoting skills to empower youth and young women as well. Also healthcare access and equal education for everybody and respect to human rights for everybody. As we all see that there were many issues taking place before the pandemic, challenges. However, when the pandemic came, these challenges became more to the surface. This doesn't mean that they didn't exist. They existed. However, because of the lockdowns, because of the many societal and behavioral changes that were taking place, these challenges increased and became of negative impact, just like the pandemic now. So mainly youth currently, according to the survey and according to the survey done also by Susanna and Yunus, we discovered that there will be slight changes of how youth perceive, for instance, in Egypt, Egypt's Vision 2030, how it can be implemented in the future, the mechanism itself. Also relatively Africa Agenda 2063 and the Agenda 2030. So basically, from my own point of view, that there will be no changes, there are dramatic changes in the policies. We have already the policies, but it's the mechanism of how youth are going to change, how the youth are going to achieve what they want in the coming period for better development, prosperity, for achieving, for reaching what they want, especially the disadvantaged and vulnerable groups among youth and young women. How can they also access services in the coming period, especially after the evolution of digitalization and that everything became simply through internet. And also how to combat the negative impacts that occurred as a result of the COVID or as a result of poor systems that used to be there before the COVID and also continued during the COVID. However, youth in partnership with organizations, the government, are trying to strengthen these systems, or to promote, to advance the services of these systems. Also, there was something very important that Yunus talked about, which is the social dialogue. So I believe that during the COVID as well, it was very important to maintain trust between youth and their governments in regards to the dissemination of right information, in regards to the services delivered, in regards to fighting any wrong information or rumors going around through social media, in regards to self-protection. So it was very important to maintain such trust that we don't usually see previously between the citizens and their governments. And my last point in regards to this question is the funding direction. It's very important in the current period that the youth and the governments and the organizations make sure that the fund is going in the right direction in regards to serving the needs of the youth and the needs of the society. As I'm quite sure that fund before the pandemic was going to certain areas according to the agendas, whether it's nationally, continental, or regional, or international. But post the pandemic, we have poor health services, we have unequal education that's delivered, we have unemployment higher rate, we have mental health issues, we have crucial areas that we need to focus the fund on. Yeah, so this is my answer in regards to this question.
Thank you, Yara. Susanna, do you have any comments?
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Yes, just to complement what Yara was saying, indeed, the pandemic, what has shown is and what we can expect is that will reverse some of the progress that has been achieved as regards to poverty alleviation. But even though, even before the pandemic, we had already reported, for example, on the fact that we were not going to achieve the target that the member states had set as regards to young people not in employment, education, and training. So even before the pandemic, there was already despite the action and despite the investments, we were already falling behind as regards to certain targets that relate to young people. So, rather than a change in priorities, I think what the crisis is showing us is how important it is to continue to strengthen investments in young people, to open fiscal space so that those countercyclical policies that Jonas referred to are very much well targeted, but also efficiently addressing opportunities to create jobs for young people. And one of the things that we see as regards to, in that sense of prioritization and emerging from the survey, and as well as other recent pieces of research, is the importance of investing in young people's mental well-being, integrating interventions that can support young people in this regard within other youth employment interventions is important. The role of sports, the role of the important role that interventions that promote the voices and representation of young people are key, and Yara certainly mentioned the power of social dialogue to make sure that there is sustainability and validity of these efforts. So I will end up by saying the immediate response to the crisis was very much around the protection of jobs. As we move towards a recovery and opening, or gradual opening of some economies, it is important to think that we still have to, there are a lot of fronts that we need to prioritize at the same time. No, like young workers that are coming back to work, they will need to be protected against the virus. So it is important to put in place measures that will ensure their occupational health, the mental well-being, and as I said, opportunities for them to voice their concerns and participate in social dialogue or other decisions that will affect them in today and tomorrow.
Thank you, Susanna. Now, the second question is, what is the youth outlook during COVID-19, and how did they respond to the evolving situation? I would expect you to touch on the volunteers, mainly unemployed, many frontliners, the work-life balance, and perhaps also the infomedia and the rumors that are sort of charging all the, especially the social media. Yara?
Thank you, Dr. Aouni, and thanks, Susanna, as well. Based on your question, the pandemic affected everybody, youth, children, women, both genders actually. And what was recognized is that the youth started to react with the situation at that time, started to go with the digitalization, the online platforms, whether for education, for improving their skills, going for online courses. We also recognized that the courses started to be fully funded or to be for free for the youth and for everybody to maintain online. Also, we started to recognize that youth started to go for online opportunities. It doesn't necessarily call job opportunities, but to volunteer into policies, advocacy, capacity building, online webinars, spreading right information, spreading awareness. Even if a person has information in regards to how to apply for a university or something, they started to voluntarily go do this online through webinars. Also, we recognized that there were two kinds of people. Let me divide them into this way: people who were staying at home, who were working offline, and people who are still working online during the pandemic. So for me, both of them were frontliners, because people who are staying at home and working online, they are still a piece of they still navigate information. They are still influencing on others, whether by information on the pandemic or information in regards to any societal, economic, or political point of views. And the ones who are offline as well, the frontliners, for instance, here in Egypt, I witnessed lots of effort done by the Egyptian Red Crescent, for instance, that they were trying to serve vulnerable and disadvantaged communities who were really in need, who don't have good digital access or online access for services. So they were trying to reach to these poor or areas that are in need for services. Also, online, there were people who started to post for the online services if you are in need for mental health, if you are in need for any kind of challenge that you are facing into your life, call this number, this hotline. You can add yourself to this group. And people started to communicate. Of course, not all of them were of good reference. Of course, not all of them were right. However, this is the role of youth here, when they started to reference what they are posting online to the others, so that right information should be disseminated. And most of them started to collaborate with different youth coalitions. As I said, like some people started to ask the envoys, whether on a national or continental or regional basis, to post for them as well these services online so that youth can access them. Also, there started to be a call for the availability of sanitary hygiene products for for women and young girls, especially that are not available for everybody. There started to be also like online delivery for such products for at home, so that during the lockdowns it was difficult for many people to access pharmacies, for instance, hospitals. There was also the online medical services that you can call a doctor if you are complaining out of any illness, or sickness. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that you are complaining of COVID. There are many diseases. So there started to be like virtual consultation between the patient and the doctor, and if it's necessarily, sometimes doctors need to visit homes. So it's not necessarily at that time that patients go to the hospital, especially that the hospitals are meant for the pandemic, and it was packed, and it was dangerous for all people to pack at that moment to hospitals for any reason. As well as there were many initiatives that were taking place to ensure the delivery of the services to everybody, whether in regards to health, in regards to consultations for education, what to pursue, what kind of skills you need. Maybe you can promote yourself, or you can access online. And what's more important now, and that I can see, is that how to capitalize on these youth initiatives, how to endorse or strengthen what has started after the COVID, because I believe that after the COVID, life is not gonna just go to the normal life before the COVID. It's not that now we can access streets, or we can the lockdown is lifted up, then we can go out easily just like before. There is still pandemic, there is still probability that people get infected again, there is still probability of another wave. So it's time now to continue what youth has started or initiated, and it's also time to promote them with tools, maybe finances, to promote them with decency. I don't want to say decent jobs, but decency in everything, decency in delivering the services, or in what they already have started. Because I believe that all the volunteers, and I'm part of them. I also volunteered on 3 different platforms, and I felt for a moment that I'm lost. What shall I do? Everything is locked down. So I believe that it's time now that we capitalize on these initiatives, that we continue what the youth started, and to ensure that the services are delivered to everybody, because it's not yet, and it's going to take time to be delivered to everybody. I guess I tackled on everything.
I think you did. I think you did.
Yeah,
perfect.
thank you.
Thank you. Susanna.
Thank you very much. I think that was quite comprehensive. Not really much to add. As Jonas mentioned, the survey was able to visualize and capture some of the activities that young people are doing to counteract and tackle the impacts of the crisis. So it already demonstrates that it is not about asking young people to stand up. They are already doing many things, and we are and we should be there just to amplify their voices and to support their activities, because they rightly know better about their needs and their rights than ourselves. One of the elements that the survey captured was as well perceptions around rights, and naturally, because of the containment and because of the lockdowns, young people of all ages felt that their right to mobility had been compromised. And you know, I don't want to say this there is a certain, you know, any causality or anyone to blame there. I think it is very hard to be, or it was very hard to be on the spot of policymakers and making decisions around when to stop the economy and when to open up again. But indeed, one of the elements that young people mention is that during the pandemic, their right to information was also affected, and that they were not able, or there was a lot of noise in terms of what was true and what wasn't. So it is important that we bear this in mind. You know, we hear about fake news, and we hear about many, you know, there are many names that are put today towards lack of information, but it is important that we stay true to the facts, and that we also help young people to gather the information that they need to make their own decisions and to support their communities, and they are actively doing that, and they are actively making sure that their communities are aware of the dangers of infections, as well as opportunities to protect themselves. So making sure that there is this right to information and this right to participation, civic participation, is protected, is very important.
Thank you. I have the last question, and I'm going to have to give each one of you just 1 minute to answer, just to sort of allow for like another 5-10 minutes questions from the audience. Now, the last question is, who has been most vulnerable during the COVID-19? What was the support provided by and to the youth? And I want you to sort of think in your mind about domestic violence, child abuse, mental health, low-income women especially, and the target of the UN, which is leaving no one behind. Yara?
1 minute is too short, but I'll try to be quick as much as possible. So as being the regional focal point for SDG 5, gender equality and empowering women under the UN MGCY. So of course, I believe that one of the most vulnerable groups were women and young girls. However, let me also say that we were all affected by the COVID with different ratios. But there are communities that used to be already vulnerable before the COVID, and they became more and more vulnerable. Actually speaking, the COVID highlighted on how vulnerable they are after it emerged, because they are the ones that were affected by the lockdown that much. They were isolated. There were many private issues they were facing, just like domestic violence. So for instance, let me say that domestic violence took place privately at homes. Many women were infected but negatively by domestic violence, causing them, hindering them from pursuing or continuing their education, promoting their self-skills online, continuing even to be source of income for the house, as work also stopped for a certain time during the pandemic. And there are many women who were of low income, so their work stopped, or it didn't stop, however, because of the the domestic pressure that she was facing, looking after the house, staying in the house for most of the time. So she was she faced lots of challenges, and the worst was that facing as well the domestic violence. Also, education being online, it might seem that it was very good to access education online, and many people were accessing it in a very proper way. However, it wasn't that equal to everybody, because for instance, refugees, children, young girls are 5 times more likely to drop out from schools before the pandemic. So during the pandemic, most of them already stayed at home. Most of them dropped out of education. They couldn't continue education online, whether because they can't access digital platforms, or the pressure they are facing at home, or that they for any reason they cannot access education anymore. So so basically these categories or these communities face lots of challenges in any country. Also they were affected more by the lockdowns. Also, we discovered that 1 in 3 women worldwide, and also I believe I base my statistics as well on what was mentioned by Jonas and Susanna in their presentation, that these women were experiencing physical or sexual violence. I actually got this information from the World Health Organization. It was posted last April, so it's women, refugees, children, vulnerable youth, disabled youth, and I was so glad to see that there were some information disseminated that can be also for disabled groups, because it's important that you reach out to everybody. But also, it's not about disability. You yourself as a person, you can be if you are unable to access right information, you're disabled for me. You cannot access right information online, you cannot access online digital platforms, then you also have a problem you're also vulnerable to rumors or wrong information. So also anybody doesn't have to be poor, rich, of middle income, anybody that couldn't access right information then is counted one of the vulnerable groups as well, and most affected by the pandemic. Also employment, what was mentioned by Jonas, I don't want to repeat again, and also Susanna, people who lost their jobs or already didn't have a job and were about to have and they didn't. Also they faced lots of problems, even if they were only volunteering, but I believe that now there will be a rushing scale of people searching for opportunities, because they can't stand staying more than 6 months without a job, or without a decent income anymore. And it's important to fight poverty from that youth fight poverty as well around. Also, it's not only about women, it's about any other category of people who have temporary jobs, so it's unstable for them, so it's unstable income. There are many also youth who are married, or they have houses, wives and children, so it's important to look after this category, and anyone who was not, or who didn't receive proper rights. And rights here, it's not only for me violence or any harmful practices affecting the young girls or women, or the diseases that are infected by both genders. Rights for me here is including everything, is including in education, health, access, your right as a human being to feel safe and secure where you are, your right to have proper mental health service when you want, your right to be happy, to access anything that you want in the current period. Well, I don't want to go also for long, but I have a lot to say.
Susanna?
Sorry, I just want to say two things. Early child marriage and FGM also, they were very important, because these people were most vulnerable during the pandemic. And I'll pass it to Susanna, not to take more time. Thank
you. Thank you. I'll pass the word to Jonas for this one.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I think, Yara, your answer is super comprehensive, and you made so many great points that we don't need to repeat again. What we can maybe say from our point of view is that first, who is most affected are obviously very disadvantaged and vulnerable youth groups. So refugees, some groups of young women, young persons with disabilities, but also predominantly young people in the informal economy, own account workers, people who just started to open up a business and now stand to lose everything from it, and that is a great concern. The second group of people very vulnerable, and obviously this intersects, are young entrepreneurs and those employed in sectors most affected by the economy. What we see, for example, in our survey is that young people saying they work in for the private sector, so either informal or formal, they tend to be much more affected than people working for, say, nonprofit or government that proved, at least in the short term, to be more resilient to this crisis. What is perhaps very important just to say, to make one last point, is that for many young people around the world, the worst is still to come. And that sounds scary, but it's also reflecting just the reality that we move from a health crisis to an economic crisis that is here to stay, and that all hopes for kind of a very quick recovery are perhaps overly optimistic, and that in many, especially low and middle income countries, we will see a significant recession and significant restrictions in the way we conduct business and the way we live for some time to come. And this will predominantly fall on those most vulnerable and least integrated in the labor market, and many of those will be young women. I just, before closing, I just want to say that at Decent Jobs for Youth, we have also initiated a blog series some time ago, where we invited young people and partners to contribute and to describe exactly kind of answers to the two questions, Dr. Ari, that you have asked. On the one hand, what have young people been doing, and on the other hand, how have they been affected? And there are many very inspiring stories. I just put the link here in the chat box. You can check it out and read up on it. And with that, I'll hand back.
Thank you. We're getting some questions, but I'm looking, most of them have been answered in the discussant period. So I just want to make 2 points and then we conclude, because we're running way out of time. I sort of second what Yara was saying. I mean, COVID-19 is a major disruption. It has really aggravated existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. And I would say that even though your survey is a little bit biased in terms of underrepresentation by poor countries, and I would say even underrepresentation from there is a sampling bias. You're getting people who are mostly educated, university educated. So there is a bias there, but it still shows you clearly how inequality is really aggravated by the COVID-19. So this is one. The other thing, which was really interesting for me, a few weeks ago we had a speaker, Jeffrey Sachs, and Jeffrey was saying that we should start viewing the SDGs as our generation implementation of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I see one of the actually contributors to one of the in the beginning of the slide, that you're actually the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights. So business and human rights is actually, when you talk about decent jobs is more than just living salary. It's about what Yara was talking about. It's a decent by all what it means. It provides different aspects, more than just living wage. I want to conclude about this. I was tempted to actually refer to the UN Global Compact and to the collective bargaining, but that's going to take us for another half an hour. So for the risk of not burdening our participants, I would like to thank you both. I mean, the three of you, Susanna, Jonas, and Yara. You've all been fantastic. And for the audience, I just want to sort of bring to your attention, we're going to have a webinar tomorrow. The speaker is going to be Paul Mason. He's the Chief Country Support of the Open Government Partnership. He's going to talk about promoting accountable, responsive, and inclusive governance. This will be our last webinar before we go to the summer hiatus. I don't know about you, but I and my team, we need a break. So we'll take a summer. And but please join us tomorrow, and please watching. We'll be letting you know about when we're going to start. Probably going to be the last week of August. Again, I thank our participants. Stay safe, stay connected, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow and when we resume back again. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.